Hi everyone, I'm Leo. You'll hear about who I am in a second. Yesterday, I was in Chicago at IRCE, and the day before that I was at the Big Commerce Growth Summit, and I was helping e-commerce craziness in the WordPress space. It's really exciting to be a developer today because literally APIs keep popping up every single day, and it's so interesting to watch how we bundle and we create middlewares, we create glue code, and we keep coming up with new answers to problems that we didn't realize we could solve. And that's what I did yesterday. I talked to a bunch of people, and we found out about more APIs are on the way, and we set plans to build more stuff, which is the coolest thing, where you don't necessarily have to worry about that. But less about that and more about GDPR. So first of all, it's coming. Actually, we're a couple weeks late. It came already. May 25th was Friday a week ago. So last Friday, a week before that. So we're about, what, 10, 11 days past GDPR? It's like winter, right? You're going to feel the tundra. That's me. That's my face. This over here is another friend of mine. This is Brendan Woods, who's a colleague of mine who helped me make this presentation, parts of the presentation. First of all, he and I are not lawyers, so do not take this as legal advice. This is purely business advice, me helping the community navigate this really complicated big topic. I'm a consultant for XWP. We do WordPress sites. We do WordPress plugins. We do lots of consulting for enterprise-level organizations. Some of the stuff I do for XWP, I think I have. I may not. Well, I can just show you guys. I am the product owner on the AMP for WordPress plugin. You can read all about what we do here. We actually have a 1.0 alpha that's coming out tomorrow, which I'm super excited about. We're bringing native AMP support to WordPress. I'm also in a team that is helping bring PWA support to WordPress core. So we're using things like Workbox to combine an ecosystem of about 50,000 plugins to bind this stuff to make everything work faster, to bring things like notification support. And WordPress, of course, powers about 30% of the web. So this is not small stuff. This is huge stuff. We recognize the power of connecting these kinds of users to the future of the web. And a lot of that is powered by things like JavaScript, which is why I think it's important to talk about here. And AMP is really funny because AMP, if you don't know, has a lot of really hard rules about JavaScript. You basically can't use most of the JavaScript you're most familiar with. And so I advocate sometimes considering not using JavaScript. And here's a great reason why. You can load your websites up to 85% faster, which is a really exciting thing. Other stuff that I'm doing. I have a background in journalism, media. I worked for a couple agencies. I worked in education. I've done a lot of stuff in WordPress. I'm also organizer of WordCamp Orange County, which is this weekend. We have a sold-out pack house of about 500 people down at UCI. I actually will be leading a panel on GDPR. I'm one of the few people in Southern California, as Vijay said, who actually cares this topic very deeply. We have some of the top privacy lawyers in California talking about this topic. I have the former owner of one of the top WordPress VIP agencies who's also going to be there, as well as the head of the CEO of a hosting company who's been dealing with a lot of these issues directly. So I actually had a meeting with these folks today, and I was like, wow, I'm surprised how we all speak the same language. We're all very, very afraid and very, very excited at the same time. I'm also organizer of WordCamp Los Angeles, which I'm sure will also have a talk on GDPR, which comes up in September. And I also help co-run the Los Angeles WordPress meetup group. We meet all across the region. We meet all the way up in downtown LA, in Hollywood, in Long Beach, where I am. There's also an Orange County WordPress meetup group, which is full of really great people. They meet in Huntington Beach. And of course, I've been researching GDPR for a while. And I've also been contributing directly to the WordPress core project on GDPR issues. We are probably the largest GDPR-related and privacy-related effort that's been put this direction. But there's also quite a few other ones, too. And I really hope that today you pick up a little bit of empathy and maybe take it back with you. And a little fun note, I'm also a consumer of craft coffee, and I hope you are, too. All right, so here's the chart. This one's scary. So this is back from 2016. Who remembers 2016? Yeah? We had Barack Obama as president. Equifax hadn't leaked yet. Target hadn't leaked yet. Home Depot hadn't leaked yet. And back then, 48% of the United States had said, I believe the companies that use and have my data are not being honest about that data. This was before all this stuff. This is before a lot of the craziness that we're seeing now started to happen. And even more extreme, in France, 62% of people felt the exact same way. And in contrast, 25% of Italians felt like the companies were trusting, And in reality, like this is actually a pretty good snapshot into the landscape of where GDPR was written. So GDPR started to pick up footprints in early 2016. Basically, it took all of these open laws that were already existing in Europe and it said, these are really complicated and really confusing. Let's stop being so confusing. Let's give clear instructions, clear directions. Let's stop being so messy. Let's advocate on behalf of a better policy. And GDPR is about users. It's about empathy. And you know, it's really weird and messy, and it's hard to define what GDPR will actually look like in its full scope. But we have a pretty good answer of where it starts from, and we can start to talk about some of those nuances as we start to unpack it. So as I mentioned, it goes into force a week ago, a little over a week ago, and it sits on top of the existing cookie laws. So if you, who here has been doing web development for more than 5 or 6 years? Right? I'm sure you've seen a notice that pops up that says you've got a cookie thing that you need to approve so we can drop this in your session. This is on top of all of that. And what it does is it takes all of these laws and it bundles them together in a way that allows you to confidently understand and get through some of this stuff in a way that advocates on behalf of better security, better privacy, and hopefully better ethics. So a couple key principles. We all, in everything that we do, as a life goal, can always do things better, right? And with privacy, this is the same basic narrative. And we're after trying to get users to trust us more. And for those of you who work in security, we have a CTO here, which I think is great. Thank you for coming. Is we want to seek out less vulnerabilities by default. So for example, at XWP, we have a very aggressive code review policy. We don't push any code that doesn't get reviewed. For WordPress VIP, we have a very aggressive additional step on top of that. So not only do we have an internal code review, but Automatic won't let us push a single line of bad code to their services. So WordPress VIP and Automatic are actually one of the few hosting companies that are fully Privacy Shield compliant. So Privacy Shield, I don't think I actually have a link, but whatever, I'll just show you guys. privacyshield.gov. So this is a really interesting, messy arrangement that the United States has set up with Switzerland that basically gives the Department of Commerce the ability to enforce this European law. So really interesting stuff. We don't actually know how it's going to affect with GDPR yet, but there's very few companies that actually have gone far enough to go into the Privacy Shield world of things. And as a whole, like we understand that as a VIP agency, that what we're after is this level of support, this level of security, because we have clients that really care about this level of sensitivity. And you know, I look at this as an opportunity. We have the opportunity to argue for every single person around us to stop doing bad things. We want to reduce the amount of data we collect. We want to reduce the amount of legal exposure we have. For those of you who work for an agency or those of you who work with other companies quite a bit, you have the opportunity to help these people. I'm calling them here clients, but they're your friends or your colleagues or the people you care about to help them navigate the space. But really, I argue that it's for all of us to hopefully do it better, that we go into a world that we really want to live in. And I have two choices, right? I don't necessarily have to go down this route. I could just say, whatever, I could just ignore the law. I would rather create a world in which I really want to live in. I want to create one that is secure and safe and compliant for these kinds of things. And I'm actually really excited about GDPR because I know that things like this might actually come to the United States. And there's a lot of people around me in the space who argue that we are going to see laws just like this come to the United States. There's actually a ballot that's on for California in the fall that will bring a law that's very similar to GDPR. It's a little bit more business friendly, a little less reporting, a little less user centric, but it is very, very similar to GDPR. And that may actually happen within the calendar year to be enforced next year. So this stuff is coming. It's coming really, really quick. And regardless of whether you are legally compliant, I recommend that everything that you do when you're designing data flows for an application, you're designing data collections, when you're designing cookies, you're designing consents, you simply should just start to think about privacy and how you can design for it. So for example, you know, would you put a glass door in front of a bathroom? Would you let people see you while you're using the bathroom? No, you wouldn't. You design for privacy in a bathroom, right? In the same way that, you know, there's another event happening across the way. There's a wall there, right? They might hear a little bit of sound crossover, but we've actually designed these spaces to be independent of each other. So for example, when you're creating an application, you should think about that privacy. And I look at this and I wonder, how do we go one step further and also design for ethics? A really good friend of mine, Morten Wren Hendrickson, he's at Morten on Twitter, which is the greatest Twitter handle ever, wrote a really good piece about designing for ethics and how ethics and design play together, especially in the web space. And he has a great quote here which says, making ethics part of our design process helps us build the world we all want to live in. And you'll hear me say this again and again. I look at this as an opportunity. GDPR gave me the financial reasons to invest into something that made sense to argue for the things that I deeply care about. And while there are legal components to this that matter, within the context of this, you'll see I have a couple links for you guys to take home with you to hopefully think about what this means for you as a user. Because that's really what I care about. I want you as users to care about this. I want you as companies to care about your users. And it's a two-sided thing. So most of you have probably heard about this so far. This is the thing that people keep talking about. What's that giant thing up there? Do you know what that is? 4%, right? 4% of your annual turnover. So if you're a $100 billion company, 4% means up to $4 billion. Well, currently there are two companies that already have major lawsuits, Google and Facebook. They're already threatening 4% of their global turnover. For those of you who aren't that big, and you're like, only 4%, well, it's or 20 million euros, whatever is greater. So it's not clear exactly how that mechanism might enforce US companies, but it is clear that there is a framework for up to this amount. And we actually have similar laws in the United States that allows for similar kinds of collections. If the FTC comes after you because, I don't know, your name rhymes with Schmacebook and you happen to have an API that had no controls for literally 7 years, and then that entire data set got used to manipulate elections all across the world, you're going to have some problems and you're probably going to face a legal consequence. So yeah, oh my God, right? You feeling it? You're like, that's a lot. That's terrifying. Don't worry. The point is you want to be a good data steward, right? You want to navigate the space with this idea of getting through it all. So you as people who are in this space should care about this topic from a very, very high level. So I heard in the back that you work in IT, right? It's the same basic premise. Like, you shouldn't have CSVs with passwords floating around your network. Like, that's a really, really basic thing. You shouldn't save your passwords in an open text file, right? You should know that that stuff should live in a vault that is SSL or RSA encrypted. You want to go through stuff that makes sense, that you no longer do things in ways that are dangerous. Really basic, right? That seems obvious, right? So you have to ask yourself repeatedly this question: how am I going to be a good data steward? And I think about this as our daily activities. So if you work for an agency, you work for a company, especially if you're a CTO, especially if you're working at all with lots of different people who don't necessarily care about this, you're going to know that you're going to see this data and watch people collect that data. You're going to design interfaces for that data collection. You're going to design ways to translate that data and send that data across APIs. And you're going to do that on a regular basis. And I ask this question at a high level. Do you actually know what data you have? Most people don't. Do you know what API data you can consume on your platforms? Do you know what's actually being there? And the most important thing that you should probably do, regardless of whether you carry legal exposure or not, is do a privacy impact assessment or a privacy impact audit. Go through and ask this question. Write down every single person who can create, read, what's you? I'm forgetting. Update, thank you. It's been a long day. Or delete data. Have a CRUD table. Literally outline every single person who might have any direct access to that database. So in our case, in the WordPress context, like, we have several different layers of that. Might be people in the dashboard, might be people who have MySQL access, might be the hosting company who is working with you. You should understand how deep this goes. So every part of that data flow application, you actually want to diagram and understand and discuss. And here's the key thing. That PIA doesn't stop the first time you do it. It becomes a Google Doc or a living doc somewhere on your network, and you should be keeping that alive so that no one is arguing against you for not having any data that's old. You should be maintaining this as part of your daily process. And I want to talk a little bit about direct and indirect data. So this is a really interesting one. I'm going to a conference tomorrow, as I mentioned, for WordCamp Orange County, and I'm really excited about it. They asked me two questions that seem pretty innocuous, but under GDPR might present a challenge. The first one is meal preference. They say, are you gluten-free? Are you kosher? Are you vegetarian? Well, some of that data might be indirectly exposing my religious background. Also, for example, what t-shirt size I wear might be exposing my biometric data. So an extra small is very different than a triple XL, right? Those are things that might tell you about a person that seem innocuous by themselves, but might actually open up a bigger question. And for those of you who came here because you have no idea what GDPR is, you only want to take one slide home, and you want to forget about everything else I talk about, and you have a phone, you want to take a picture of a single slide, this is the one to do it. This is literally the most important thing that you should know. This is your basic audit for the day. GDPR and really privacy law as a whole leans around this really, really basic concept. This is your non-legal speak for legal stuff. Don't get data without consent. Don't have data without consent. Don't give data to someone else without consent. Don't use data without consent. Don't process data, especially without consent. If you lose data, especially sensitive data, know that it's going to be a problem, so don't lose it. And if you do lose that data, you need to tell people about it. Really, really obvious, right? Seemingly so. Most people look at GDPR and they freak out. They say, oh my God, all this 4%, oh, right to be forgotten. Oh my God, I have no idea how to do it. Like, no, this is why these things are basically asked. So for example, if you're using Facebook and Facebook has the ability to collect your data and process your data in the background and you haven't consented to that processing, are they in violation of GDPR? Probably. You know, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sitting here defending or describing European law, but this is basically how the law is written. You can read over the 200 pages or you can read this one slide and you're now experts on GDPR too. Not really, but maybe no. So let's talk about data itself. So data, personal data in particular, has to be about a data subject. So that has to be any person who's actually identifiable. Identifiable is also a little bit of a messy thing, but it might be a name, it might be an identification number, it might be location data, it might be email address, it might be a cookie piece of data depending on what that cookie contains. It might be an IP address, which most people don't think is sensitive. For example, like if we are all connected to the same Wi-Fi network, if you're all logged into Wi-Fi today, we're all currently sharing the same external IP address. But technically, we are all somewhat identifiable. Or if you're really weird and like me and you use weird operating systems and weird browsers and you do weird things, my identifier, my geographic footprint on my web browser experience is going to be very obvious. So if I'm testing a special Chromium bug or Chromium build that's a 32-bit on some special flavor of Linux, and my browser reports that header, suddenly that one piece of information across a very large data set can be identifiable. So people don't necessarily realize that level of detail. And if that data contains other information that I don't want them to collect, that data suddenly contains a lot more information. Inversely, you might think that that might be innocuous because you're on an iPhone running Safari, right? Really, really boring, really basic browser header. But that data itself can be identifiable with other information. And the whole piece of this idea is that you might have 2 or 3 different pieces of data that come together to describe a single person. So that IP address plus someone's location data plus one other data factor might actually be able to identify that person in that given record. So this becomes a very, very messy topic, and you have to describe that empathy. If someone doesn't want their data out there, or didn't want their data to be collected in the first place, you have to understand what this means to be able to navigate that topic. So most data is not that sensitive, at least in terms of extreme sensitivity. But I recommend having the empathy to understand what is actually extremely sensitive. So things like racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, health data, sex life or sexual orientation, or past or expunged criminal convictions. This stuff is extremely sensitive because based on this information, you might actually be able to, force someone's opinions and change someone's opinions. People don't necessarily want everyone to know whether they're married or divorced, for example. People don't necessarily want to know they don't want people to know whether they belong to a union or not. These kinds of things can prevent other kinds of problems. And under this European law, they have this idea of sensitive personal data that should be collected with very, very careful sensitivities. And today, one of the perspectives that we argue, I'm not a lawyer again, but I recommend you take a really conservative, really risk-averse approach to collecting any data that might be identifiable about a person. Because as I mentioned, that indirect data question is really, really important. Anything that might be messy here is something you should understand and ask, is this data that I should be collecting in the first place? Yes?
DOB should be on there.
Date of birth is not technically listed under sensitive personal data, but it is sensitive personal data, as is gender, for example. And this is one of those messy components of this slide, right? That I'm pulling from the legal text, and in reality, those are things that are equally as sensitive, as are things like European identifying numbers, as might be your business license number. Those things you don't necessarily want to be collected unless you want people to have that information in the first place. So speaking of data and weird, messy topics, date of birth is a really interesting one, but I'm not going to touch that larger topic. I'm actually going to talk about data processing. Do we all know what I mean by data processing? Yeah? OK. So I mentioned a little earlier about APIs and what APIs can do. If I have your information, I have your IP address, I can do a bunch of things with that data. I can geolocate it. I can look at its history. I can see who else might be in that network. I can take that information. Well, that data, you're not supposed to do anything with that data that you have unless you've told the user that you're going to do something with that data. There are a lot of people who do things with that data that they're not supposed to. And we're going to talk about these things. They're called robots, yeah? So, APIs are oftentimes robots, right? They're just, here's an application. I have an interface that you can send data to, and you can pull data back from. You can post information, you can get information, and you can manipulate information on the fly. And that's actually most of what the web is doing today. We at XWP spent a lot of time doing integrations with WordPress, with RESTful APIs, with GraphQL APIs. We do all kinds of stuff that takes these really big data sets, and we try to get and manipulate that information in ways that are really interesting. but consent is really critical in that exchange. We actually have to do it legally, otherwise we may face bad things. So before I talk about robots, let's talk about personal data. Again, about techniques. So why are people collecting personal data? What are they doing with that personal data? Well, you might be supporting someone in their direct business communication. So maybe it's a CRM, maybe it's emails, maybe it's social media. This is a normal part of your daily life. You actually have to use that data to be able to communicate with other people. So for example, like we might have a business relationship and we're contacting back and forth. Or you might be going B2C, you might be directly marketing to a consumer, right? And so you might need that personally about the consumer, but they also have to opt into that conversation. Remarketing. So I keep giving this example because I think it's pretty obvious. So a little while ago, I was in the market for a guitar. And I went online, I was looking for a guitar, and suddenly I had all of these things, all these ads that appeared everywhere all across my internet experience about what guitar I should buy. And then I purchased a guitar. It was, it's a nice guitar, I like it. It's in my living room. What do you think happened after that? Well, they continued to send me notices about other guitars I might buy. They're just like the one that I just bought. I was like, I'm not going to buy another guitar. I have one. I'm happy with the one that I have. Why do I need a second or a third or fourth one? And that remarketing effort is actually a really big thing. There's an argument that this has been forcing people to inflate conversion rates at much higher yields than we really should be comfortable with. And another interesting part of this too is things like lookalike targeting profiling. If there were one thing I could opt out of Facebook, this would be the one that I can't, right? So this is this notion that someone who looks just like me, who's like certain pages or has these kinds of friends, who's been to these kinds of places, who's been around for Facebook for this long, who went to this school, who's under this financial bracket because they purchased data from another third party, which I didn't agree to have that data in the first place, or had Facebook able to have that data to buy. Based on all of that data, people who look just like me might be able to do something else. Lookalike targeting is actually what powers most of how Facebook and AdSense and DFP, if you're familiar with DoubleClick for publishers, works. This is how the internet makes money and sells things. That being said, it's a duality of uses, right? As I mentioned, if you're talking to a friend, if I'm reaching out to a colleague, if I'm finding VJ on Discord, that data is allowing me to find someone that I want to interact with. And that makes the services more convenient. It also allows me to find someone who I haven't seen in a long time, a colleague, a partner that I really care about. And as I mentioned, it was nice to be able to see many options for guitars. Maybe I wanted to buy that one, right? The thing is, it gets a little stickier. You also help advertisers, which can be companies or political groups, influence your behavior in ways that you may not necessarily want to be influenced by. As I mentioned, things like returning purchases. I already bought the guitar. I'm not going to buy a second or third one. This is a $500,000, $2,000 instrument. It could be a lot of money on that purchase. Why are you forcing me to make another purchase when I've already made one? Sometimes it might be much smaller. So for example, if you're purchasing something on Amazon and you bought a $10, I don't know, a $10, what's that? You bought deodorant, right? That's a classic one. They actually have a whole model built on residual purchases. You buy deodorant, and all of a sudden it's like, you're going to need deodorant in a month, so why don't you buy it in about a month, right? It keeps reminding you that you can make this reiterative purchase. And that seems to be a good thing to a certain extent. It may help that user, but it also may be forcing you to make purchases that you don't necessarily want to make. And so you as a user, under this law, should have the ability to opt out of that kind of information. Another good example of this is the inflated ratings. So talking about Amazon is kind of obvious because they do something similar to this. My favorite one to pick on is Yelp. So if you were to do some sort of holistic systemic analysis to try to figure out what the ratings actually mean, the scores that you see actually aren't tied to any real data. So that data that they're using is trying to manipulate customer behavior into their preferred partners or into an advertising partnership. It gets really, really messy. I really like Yelp. I think Yelp is a great place to get really good information. But that being said, it can be very manipulative. I don't understand the personal data that they've collected and how it's going to be used externally. And also changing opinions. So this is something that in the business world, people try to spend a lot of time doing. If they see a bad review, they really work to pull that review up to a good review. Or, as I mentioned, that review might be weighted down so low because it is in the business's experience goals to make every rating seem positive. So, for example, you see very few one-star reviews on Airbnb, right? You don't. So what they do is they either shuffle them way to the bottom, or they work with that company to try to make those ratings positive. So ratings can be very, very messy, and that's one of those things you might see as a manipulation of data. And it could be legal, it could not be legal, depending on what part of the world you're in. As I mentioned, it gets sticky, it gets messy. War is 90% information. And you guys get the video that the other group didn't get, so I can't play it. I want to play this for you. Let's make this happen. Yeah, it is a YouTube video. There we are.
Corporations like Google, Facebook, Amazon, all of these large companies are making tens or hundreds of billions of dollars off of monetizing people's data. I've been telling companies and governments for years that data is probably your most valuable asset, and individuals should be able to monetize their own data. That's their own human value, and people normally don't see any upside of that and are exploited.
So that's Brittany Kaiser's former director of Cambridge Analytica, who worked with the people that I'm about to describe, who helped do lots of things with data. As I mentioned, so in 2014, Facebook finally closed its open API that basically allowed anyone to do whatever it wanted with no data collection of the people who were consuming that API. Some really, really tricky things that were broken by design that they didn't necessarily care about. And to pick on Facebook just a little bit further, Facebook was created as an app for Mark Zuckerberg to find out what girls he thought were hot. He built an entire model around a system of collecting data that was problematic. And if you, by design, are designing things that are not good, that are not ethical, that don't add anything to the ecosystem, don't be surprised that if 10 years later, it's going to have something major like this happen. So Cambridge Analytica, for me, is a scandal that is personal. This number is actually wrong now. I mentioned this last time too. It's 89 million United States users that had their Facebook data compromised, and I'm one of them, right? I didn't consent to have my data be collected or processed in that place. I didn't consent to having my data in that API. I didn't consent to having my data be used in ways that I didn't expect. And what kind of data would you ask, right? What do they have? What do they do with that data? Well, these are things like names, phone numbers, email addresses, birth dates, friend networks, activity, so what I did, where I went, and what I did on the website. Location history, so if I've ever checked in anywhere, and maybe what time I posted and where I posted that message, as well as my entire friend network's data of the same kind. That's a lot of information. And so what they did is they took all of that, and they were able to then run that information through an API to develop psychographic profiling, and then use that data to be able to determine things like lookalike targeting with higher level of specificity, to then use in campaigns for political elections in places like Argentina, the United Kingdom for Brexit, the Czech Republic, Kenya, India, Nigeria, St. Kitts and Nevis, as well as the United States during the 2016 election. It's very, very clear. And in fact, this is a really interesting story because we were talking about this back in 2014 when Facebook closed their API. This is a story that's been going on for literally 3 or 4 years, and no one cared about it. This is one of the reasons why I got excited about GDPR, because I knew I could finally talk about this in this space and people might actually show up. Even though, as we were joking, this room is nowhere near as full as it should be. And no one really seems to care about this topic because I don't want people to be manipulated, right? I think we all should be fighting to not let this kind of stuff happen. But it gets worse. So, you know, Uber. Who here likes Uber? Anyone? 2 people, 3 people. You guys are honest, thank you. So Uber has some major problems with their business model, major problems with their application, major problems with the social reputation. I feel like you must be enjoying this conversation because I'm just poo-pooing on all these companies who I actually quite like. Uber is one that I don't like because they have probably some of the least ethical data practices, and they've been well caught for it. So raise your hand here if you have an iPhone. This is probably half the room, right? And about this half the room, if you've ever uninstalled Uber, well, up until like 2016, they actually left stuff behind on your device where they could still collect your location data, they could still collect your transaction data, they could still collect your usage data. They suddenly had all of this information on users in Europe, in the United States, illegally. Very similar, this is from last year, this is August 2017. They were talking about how they could just take location data about users because they wanted to develop an understanding of where they might need rides. They made up some stupid, excuse. They knew they were doing bad things, and they were trying to monetize that data by selling it to a third party, such as one that might rhyme with Schmacebook or Schmamazon or Schmoogle. Or Equifax. Raise your hand here if you have a credit score. Should be the entire room, right? We all do. You don't have a choice whether Equifax collects your data. This is something that you're forced into. Well, about half of their data set was lost last year in a really complicated breach. It was very, very messy. And as a result of that, it gets way worse, and I'm about to talk about it. They apologized. They set up a website. They offered free credit managing. Do you all know what kind of website they set up? Set up a WordPress site, because of course they did. And they had some gung-ho developer who was like, I know WordPress, and spins up a form. He's like, all right, I'm going to bind all these things together. And they're like, OK, well, you know what's a better way to do this? Let's have a backend application that then adds them as a user and put that data out somewhere. And like, I know what I'm doing. Well, they didn't call us. We didn't build it for them. And well, they also turned on this API that, the API for WordPress isn't as secure unless you know what you're doing, because it's not really built that way, because it's different. The technology is not meant for that. Well, it took one really clever developer about 20 minutes after this had happened. They'd already collected, I think, almost 500,000 users to determine that the open API had then revealed the entire people who complained about this. It makes me so terrified to recognize that this whole system that we're talking about is broken, because Equifax didn't realize how the technology worked. And in their breach plan to respond, they'd done an even worse thing by making it a clear egg-on-face situation. And that's the reality of the system that we're in. You don't necessarily consent to your data being given to Equifax or Experian or TransUnion. You have to work in the system. But don't worry, it gets worse. I love this chart. This makes me so happy. So raise your hand here if you've ever had a Yahoo email address, right? Probably most of the room. Well, guess what? Your password was leaked like 3 times. And they probably sent you 50 emails about changing your password. And you probably didn't, because most people didn't. As I mentioned, 143 million or 145 million, depending on how you look at it, Equifax users had their information leaked, as well as the entire data set of adult friend finder. So people who were like, I'm going to go cheat on my wife, who then had their information leaked. They had their entire user table leaked. eBay had a credit card scandal. Target had a credit card scandal. Home Depot had a credit card scandal. Sony PlayStation Network had the vast majority of its network leaked, right? This is a really, really big problem. And people don't necessarily realize these applications are collecting really, really large sets of data about their users in ways that might be weird and might be sensitive. And I recommend that if you at all are building a web application in JavaScript and PHP and Java and Ruby on Rails and Rust if you're crazy and Go if you're crazier, if you're doing something cool and you're making something worth your time, stop and spend at least a day or two, a week, a month if it takes it, to go through and evaluate that application's design to make sure that you've built in for privacy, as well as security, as well as ethics, and make sure that your business model can sustain not stealing information or misusing information of your users, right? That's the crux of this talk. We don't want this to happen. I don't want there to be an Equifax or an Uber or an adult friend finder that has a problem like this ever again. And God forbid, Yahoo, right? Like it's a criminal offense. All right, there's an elephant. Not to be so serious. There's a giant elephant in the room. He's really cute. You all agree? Feel like a moment to breathe? Okay. Who does this apply to, right? I haven't talked about that yet. Well, technically, any company collecting or processing the personal data of data subjects who are in the union apply to GDPR. It's a really, really messy, legal, nuanced thing. So technically, I leave for Europe on Monday. I'll be in the UK for a day and then on to a whole wild, fun trip. Well, guess what I'm doing on Monday? I'm filing a bunch of data subject access requests for every single application that I can. And I'll be requesting that information because technically my data is under GDPR. And I'd like to know what some of these companies have on me. It doesn't actually matter where the company is located or the nationality of the persons. So as an American in Europe and the UK, by the way, even though Brexit proceedings are still occurring, GDPR went into effect while they were in the EU, and they are covered under GDPR. People in that continent, in the EU, could actually request for these kinds of rights. And the concept of the United States law is extraterritoriality. Like, this is something that means that law affects everyone across the world who might have these kinds of relationships. And the United States government does have working relationships with essentially every partner in the EU. So the laws do vis-a-vis affect this. And there's actually quite a bit of law that fits in the extraterritoriality realm. So things like hacking, for example, are another version of this. Things like murder, things like theft. These kinds of things are things that Interpol and the UN work closely to make sure it doesn't happen and doesn't affect and doesn't taint the entire world. Because we ultimately want to create a place that's safer and better for everyone. So do you really need to follow this? So if you have a business in the EU, or you work for an EU company, or you're processing data of EU citizens, you 100% need to follow GDPR. That's crystal clear. here's something you might want to consult a lawyer on, is the no and maybes. If you actively block EU traffic, or you're doing what NPR does, which I'd love to show you guys. So if I go to NPR in England, and I opt out of processing, this is what I get. I get 1996. And like, here's the thing, like 0.35 seconds, like I love that. Like, it's a really fast web experience. There's no images, there's no CSS, there's no JavaScript, there's no Google fonts, it's just a fast web experience. That's the reality. We're seeing that people no longer want that extra cruft. USA Today, which of course is a WordPress VIP website network, they have a whole bunch of sites that run on WordPress VIP. I think I have the link. Well, let's see if I do. I think I still have it. Ooh. Yeah. Oh, this is fun. OK. So who here is a front-end developer in the room? Like 2 or 3, I think. Yeah. So you all know what time to first meaningful paint means, yes? So good time to first meaningful paint should be around 3 to 4, maybe 5 seconds if you're really slow. So before GDPR turned off all the ads, they have a really heavy website, lots of things going on. 14.3 seconds. Talk about successful web performance. And what does Lighthouse say? It's a 3. And of course, you turn it off. What happens? It's a 2.9. Look how major that is. You go from a 3 score to an 86. First interactive beta at 3 seconds. Consistently interactive beta at 3 seconds, right? Like that's really, really good. So it's clear that the team at USA Today is trying their very best, but AdOps is not working with them. And off topic, but on topic, there are techniques that things like ads inside AMP actually allow for a split performance. So one of the killer features of AMP and why Google has spent so much time around AMP, one of the reasons why at least, is, well, first of all, it's an open source project that helps the entire web, but things like ad delivery get sped up way through the nose. You don't necessarily have to deliver ads in the way that USA Today is delivering on that web performance. Right? There's alternate approaches to the same basic problem. And I recommend that if this is a problem for you, if you know that ads are going to cause a negative user experience, build it into your product by design. Make it so that your users can opt out of all the excessive tracking and all the excessive things that are causing problems for your website. Back to VJ's face for a second. So if you're actively blocking EU traffic, if you have nothing to do with the EU, if you avoid EU-based clients and you don't collect any data at all, you might be able to fall out of GDPR. But I would imagine 99% of the things that you do probably fall in the maybe category. Most of the things you're going to do are going to touch aspects of GDPR, touch aspects of European data, touch aspects of European users, and you should probably consider implementing some of the privacy controls that we're about to talk about, and consider these kinds of rights that we're about to talk about so that you have the empathy for your users. And the same way that you should be considering mobile-first design and accessibility and localization, all of these other epic topics that you probably should be doing by default, privacy is one of those, and GDPR is an excuse to talk about privacy. All right? Do the right thing. So GDPR, they have a website. It's really ugly. It doesn't work well. You can read about the text online if you choose to do so. I don't recommend going there. I recommend going to everywhere else. It's all about user rights, though. The right to portability. You, as a user, have the right to now go and request a website to give you all of their data in a machine-readable, simple format. So for example, they can't send you a PDF with all these things that are burned in. They can't mail you a piece of information that you can't actually do anything with that data. They send you a JSON. They send you CSVs. They send you an Excel file. They send you something that you can actually process and use. And by the way, GDPR is about making businesses care more about users, as I mentioned. It's these rights that matter. Right to rectification. You have the right to actually go and say that data is wrong. The data is not correct. I don't want that information to be saying this. I can change that information. So for example, I mentioned Facebook's collecting this data about me and probably you. And they also have things like shadow users that you don't necessarily have an account, but they still collect information about you. They might still serve ads to you. Well, if that information is wrong, you can go to Facebook and say, correct it, at least in the EU. The right to object. As I mentioned, this profiling question is very, very messy, and it's not something that I agree with, personally. I, as a user, have the right to object. And here are my Zuckerberg jokes. I promised 3 of them. He remembered your birthday when no one else did. processing joke about the birth date. Here's a second one. This one's great. You have to follow along. This looks amazing. I love Star Wars. This is him over here. He says, Star Wars replies back and says, we know, right? It's processing. You can opt out of processing. And here's a third one. My dad told me you're spying on us. He's not your dad, right? This is the kind of stuff that Facebook may or may not know about you or may not predict or suggest. I'll mention something that was very, very weird. My mom works for the state on a job that has extreme sensitivity. And she works with people who, inside a VPN and a locked computer, a separate device that she doesn't use Facebook on. So she has these clients who she obviously knows their names, she reads their records, goes through all the stuff. Why is it that Facebook is suggesting that she add her clients? It's a great question that I would love to know the answer to when it's clear that these people don't know her and aren't searching for her per se, right? That data is coming from another data set. And that worries me. It's because of stuff like this, because they're processing information that isn't clear to the user that they collected. And this is really about the right to know about that profiling in the first place. They still don't really admit how that profiling works, but they do explain it at things like their major conventions. This one's my favorite one, the right to be forgotten. So you can go to any service that is on the web in the EU and actually request for all of your data to be removed. We actually at the WordPress core team spent a lot of time developing tools around this. It's really, really hard to answer how this works to the full ecosystem because there's so many different questions. And at the end of the day, we know we haven't solved the problem yet. We've just launched V1, really. That's all we've done. But we've provided hooks and filters and the opportunities for people to be able to add that stuff to a subject access request to be able to remove that data or export that data in a way that is unified across the platform. So what this means is that if you're Ron Swanson and you yell at your iPad and you say, erase all pictures of Ron, you all know who Ron Swanson is from Parks and Rec? You should all be like Will Smith and say, you're good, don't worry about it. One other tidbit that I'll mention about these kinds of requests, if you're working at a company that might have a CTO, you might have something like this called the Data Protection Officer. This is usually a person, and sometimes is a CTO, sometimes it's not a CTO, sometimes it's a legal contact, whose job is to actually know about that data stuff. So that privacy impact assessment I talked about earlier, or maybe the data flows of the business model, this person's job is to understand this and be able to confidently say, this is what is happening here. And in the event of a breach or a complaint with the Data Protection Authority, this is the person who's going to go and represent your company. Sometimes it's a lawyer, sometimes it's not. The DPOs in Europe right now are basically all booked. So if you really want a really good job and you understand data flows and you have some interest in this training, like you can go make a six-figure job very, very easily and some. And this is really meant for people who have large-scale processing of special categories of data. So for example, I anticipate Facebook to have several DPOs. I don't know if they do. I haven't actually looked it up, but I imagine they have several. And one of the things they would be advocating for, as I mentioned, around this idea of consent and what that actually looks like. And this, by the way, for all the designers here, is really, really ugly and really, really funky and really, really bad. But I actually believe that's better that way, right? You don't necessarily want people to do this kind of work in the first place. And if you're collecting tons and tons of information, you have to demand people go through this consent. So this is from PageFair. I can link over to this if you guys are interested. They talk about some of the questions here. They talk about duration, how long you're going to collect that data. They talk about unambiguous specific affirmative action, not yes by default. So you not only have to click yes, but you also have to click it twice. Yes, are you sure? Contact details of the data controller and the list of categories of the processor. So they're expecting you, in this case, it actually has the zip code and in the city and the country who's actually holding onto the data. And to a certain extent, you can also click on this and then see how long they're going to collect the data, how long they're going to process the data, and what the data agreement is like, right? Very, very messy. The purpose of processing, granular opt-in, so you don't have to actually have to say yes to everything. You actually have to click yes, 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 yes for every one of those partners. So in this case, there's 251 partners. So for example, someone like PayPal, who has 400 partners, it requires a full-on data graph model to understand who they send their data to. They have a model like this that's appearing in the UK and in Europe. Details of rights to complain to supervisory authority to access, correct, and transfer data. You actually have to be able to have a place on your website to then go and complain to the Data Protection Authority on your website. Some really hardcore stuff, right? Because at the end of the day, like, they want you to be above board. They want you not to lie. They want you not to collect data that you're not supposed to be collecting. Pretty straightforward, right? And when you have a breach, you actually have to respond to that breach. Within 72 hours, you actually have to report it to that authority. And then you have to tell your customers in a relatively short time. So this is hard because you may have really large data sets, you may not understand your data flow, but if you've done a PIA, if you've audited all of that stuff on a regular basis, and you've planned for a reach, you've written up a document, you have a key person at your company whose job is to understand what that looks like, this won't be a problem. And really, you have to ask this question. If I were the user of your application, if I were the user of your website, if I were the person whose data was lost, how would I feel right now? And if you don't have a confident answer to that, if you don't have a way to navigate that, that's going to be one of the first things you should try to do as a response to privacy measures all across the world. Calling this out one more time, for those of you who may be familiar with some of the European laws, there's some changes to the actual data types. They expect things like IP addresses, mobile IDs, email addresses, all that stuff is now included. Geolocation data is also included. Sensitive personal data, as we talked about, is included. And birthdays, as I mentioned, was also one of them as well. Sensitive personal data also includes things like health, race, religion, and political opinion. And also biometric data. So for example, if you have a phone and you have a fingerprint reader, that's biometric data that's being collected about you. If you have a watch that's collecting your weight or your heartbeat or your steps, all of that stuff is biometric data. That data combined with an insurance data set, for example, could give you different rates for life insurance, could give you different rates for medical insurance. That data is extremely sensitive and you don't necessarily want it going to the wrong person. So advocating on behalf of that privacy for your own sake is what I argue every single user should do. So yeah, so ride your data set. This is a little spreadsheet, a little unicorn. If you don't, I warned you, there are people who wear suits. They will come after you. So let's talk about some responsibilities or some takeaways for those of you who run a company or have any kind of management experience within a company. Understand the controller and processor. You're probably a controller of data. You're probably a processor of data, certain kinds of it. Understand what that means. Understand responsibilities under the law, the United States law and European law. Data scope and audience. Who is your audience? What data are you collecting about it? And consider reducing it at every given turn. And if your core business is data, if you're collecting and aggregating using data in ways that could be potentially manipulative or problematic in the ways we've already defined, really look closely at your business model and understand that you may have a venture that could be going, the way of the platypus. We spent a lot of time working with publishers at XWP, and we try to understand their pain points to answer the questions about what this thing looks like. So we ask a lot of questions around reader consent. So with reader consent, we actually want to know about how that consent looks like. When we look at subscribers, we want to know whether we can legally profile. We want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what that content looks like. So for example, things like NPR, as I mentioned earlier, they actually turned off all that data tracking because they're optimizing for flow. They want people to click on stories, they want people to get to the next story. That kind of stuff matters. You can't just collect the data willy-nilly. You actually need to have legal consent for that processing before you can do anything with it. Here's a classic one too, accepting submissions for contests. So a lot of websites might have contests where you fill in a thing, you win a free trip, you get a free thing. You actually have to be really, really careful. We had a publisher who didn't have the proper level of consent. They had a third-party processor who had a terms of service on their website that had insert here all throughout their terms of service. That stuff is really, really dangerous. You don't want to have a processor break the rules. So it's actually a major responsibility for you. If you're working with a third party, understand what they do, make sure that their stuff is just as good as yours, and if they don't work with them. Don't take on that risk. And this is also a really big topic, tracking for ads and retargeting. As I mentioned with USA Today, people are constantly tracking for ads, and that stuff is with the third party that they actually have to opt in. So if you turn off all the tracking on your website, can a user still get those ads? That's a really basic thing. We allow for that to happen on the sites that we're working with. And account creation. When a user creates an account on your application, who here has an account creation feature on any of the sites they work on? A couple people, yeah? So you want to give your users clear, explicit understanding what you're doing with that data. So you collect their name, their email address, their birth date, all of that stuff. Tell them what you're going to do with that data and how long you're going to keep it for and what happens if their account goes stale. Give them a clear answer. And these are some of the topics that I think also really matter surrounding that as it relates to development and technology. So I mentioned a couple times about escaping and sanitizing data. So whenever you bring in inputs and you send outputs from a database, you always want to be sanitizing, at the very least, for things like code injection. So this is a really big deal for us in the PHP world because SQL injection is a very, very common problem. It's still a problem today. It's hard to break all the rules if you have a code review process in place, but we still find things, really, really small things that are pretty edge case, but you'd be surprised. It is our job at every given moment to make sure that you're escaping and sanitizing for every input, every output. SSL and encryption. Every website you use should be using SSL. And if you can, as I mentioned earlier with the Equifax example, they could have used a WordPress site to stand up what they did, but they didn't put their data in a encrypted database. They didn't actually understand how that part of the data flow worked. When you're binding that information that's sensitive, you want to put it in a place that's a secure vault with very limited access, so very few people will be able to access that data. If you don't, you will actually have pain points. If you're doing things with education data or health data, things like HIPAA or FERPA, this stuff becomes even more important. And CRUD, as I talked about earlier, goes one layer further, where you actually have to have different level access based on who is what at the company. So the CTO or the CFO might have full wide access, but a low-level doctor would only have access to their own patients or people that they've got special appointments with. That kind of stuff is really, really messy and really, really challenging. But for those who can navigate that space, there's a major opportunity to be able to advocate on behalf of that patient's empathy. So as a developer, one of the things I talked about earlier, for those of you who were here before we started the actual event, is you should not be letting people collect or transmit data without consent. You should get opinionated on the subject, and you should be pushing back and advocating for a better workflow. How you become a director of technology or a CTO is this exact thing. You should be arguing for the best data transmission. And you'd be surprised at how few people do this. It's actually one of the biggest pain points that I see, is that most developers are agnostic about this topic. Most developers are agnostic about topics around security as well. I'm like, so you just want your website to get hacked and your website to be illegal? Like, is that what we're building? That should not be the case. And this in particular comes with things like APIs and data partners. So if you're working with something like Google Analytics, you're working with things like Facebook ad data, you're working with things like DFP, or maybe some sort of tracking software that might be testing for user behavior, all of that stuff. Understand how these technologies work. Ask the question. Don't just integrate something. And then when you're working with this data partner, make sure that there's a contract, a piece of information that sits on your website that describes what that looks like, so that you don't get in trouble for collecting that data in the first place. And my favorite part about this, less stuff means faster websites. Who here likes a faster web? Everyone. I love that, right? Faster web. We have faster and faster internet. We have faster and faster processors. And we now have the ability to continue to reduce the amount of cruft. We don't need it anymore. So what WordPress.org is doing for GDPR. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm doing a bunch of stuff with WordPress. We added a privacy policy builder to our platform. We added the ability for people to export out and remove information from that content well. So honoring the right to be forgotten, the right to portability. We wrote admin guidelines for people to actually be able to navigate this. My colleague Heather Burns actually released just today a full open source guideline to be able to talk through what this looks like for other ecosystems. So now we're working with Drupal to also build this out further. I have personal interest to also extend this to React and Vue and Angular, because this is an issue that affects the entire web, not just our ecosystem. And for us, we have this major tool that we're building called Gutenberg, which is a React front end. It's been a project that's been going on for the last year and a half. It's a major project. It's the largest open source effort currently in the WordPress ecosystem. And it's a huge project. But I've been telling everyone again and again and again, data privacy right now, because it's such an empty, adopted piece of what we're doing, is actually more important than this thing that's going to change the future of the software. And for those of you who are interested, I actually think this URL might be wrong now. We just changed it to, I think, core privacy, because we renamed, because we actually now believe GDPR is out of date. We should be talking about this as a more advanced topic. And so for those of you who care about this, know that this is a topic that's going to move on. But if you really do want to know, let me know, and I'm happy to bring you into the fold into some of these privacy topics. So for key next steps for users, privacy is not an American concept. Most of you probably came in today feeling maybe somewhat edged and maybe somewhat concerned about data privacy. I really hope that you go home and you think about this a little bit deeper, and you advocate on behalf of better data privacy. So, and work with your friends, and work with your colleagues, work with your companies to advocate on behalf of better data privacy. And understand what data about you exists, and don't give it away all anymore. And for those of you who are concerned about your data that might exist out there, go and request for removal of that data. At least go and request for exports of that data. Understand what that looks like, and ask the questions that are a little bit harder. And I really believe this might usher in a new era of the web. I want to talk a little about user tools, because this is my favorite little part about this. Where do we want to go? OK. So some of the tools that are existing out there for GDPR, better GDPR compliance, there are alternate answers to analytics. So this tool, Matomo, is actually an open source analytics tool. I have not used it yet. I haven't found an excuse to use it yet. But it's something that I'm actually very excited about, because this is a little bit more user privacy centric. So for those of you who are a little concerned about Google Analytics, I really like Google Analytics. It's a great tool. This might be a better answer to these kinds of data collection. Leaflets. So for those of you who just want a good map that runs fast on your website, that's open source and doesn't necessarily use really heavy hardcore APIs, there is a feature here that allows for pretty maps that are really quick, that are really lightweight to load, that don't have fancy hardcore iframe embeds. This is just a div with data that's been flowed from a really basic container, right? You don't necessarily have to go the Google route. There are other answers out there. Though I do like Google Maps. It is a very great mapping application. Consider what that means for your application if you can use it. Cookie management. So as I mentioned, cookies are a thing that you actually have to bring in. And there are two here that, again, I have not used either of them. We've come up with different solutions. But these are ones that you can grab off the shelf. So this one is tarcherauction.js, and it has the ability for you to either pay for a service or actually go through and try to pull stuff out. And it's partly open source. There's also CookieBot, which is another basic service as well that you can pay a monthly fee for that'll start to do some of these things manually. And they have a whole bunch of extra interface tools that does some of that stuff I was talking about, right? Like this is the hardcore ability of that kind of information that you want to be able to provide to your users. And technically under GDPR, it has to be as easy to opt in as it is to opt out. So if you want to worry about that interface, do it. If you want to pay someone $15 a month so you don't have to worry about 1,000 hours of engineering, do that. That's essentially my argument. For those of you who have any kind of social media sharing buttons, you're probably using JavaScript to give away some of that data that is extremely sensitive and valuable. In reality, the sharing APIs for most of these platforms can all be handled in a link. So for example, the Facebook share is a simple PHP call. You don't actually need anything JavaScript. So it's facebook.com/share/share.php !u equals, and there's your regular API. You can throw anything in there. You no longer need to throw in a really complicated JavaScript exchange. You don't necessarily have to do the things we used to do because we know that they're bad. So advocate on behalf of your users if you're worried about that information. Here's a great one, Ghostery. Ghostery is a premium offering, but also a free offering, and it is really, really powerful. So Ghostery, let's go to a publisher like NPR. So NPR, I've been picking on them. I really like NPR. I'm a member of NPR. I think you all should consider supporting public radio. But I'm going to pick on them anyway. So right now, they are currently collecting 11 different tracking pieces on my site. So you can all see my little tool here. I can see that they're using things like DoubleClick for publishers, they're using net ratings, they're using Rocket Fuel, using Google Tag Manager to probably spit out even more JavaScript stuff, using Chartbeat, all of this tracking data that ultimately leads to a much heavier site. Also, that data sits there persistently. And there's another tool that I really like called Cookie Auto Delete, which isn't here on my list. So this is a Chrome extension that you can also download as well. And what this does is it forces those cookies to no longer stay persistent in your session. So going back to NPR, I'm using this plugin actively on the web. It'll tell me that it's, for example, removing these cookies every time I come to the site. As a user, I can actually force these sites to be more compliant because I don't necessarily want them to share that ad data across the site. These are things that, again, if you really care about the topic, you should start to build into your workflow. You could also, for example, graylist this so that that only exists until the end of your session. Or you could whitelist this to always allow that to be persistent. But what happens with Cookie Auto Delete is the minute you close your tab, it removes all of those cookies unless you've told it to keep them, which is a generally better approach because these websites shouldn't necessarily be placing cookies you don't necessarily want. One final tool that I'll mention as well, Privacy Badger is a tool by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, entirely open source. I really like open source projects, and I'd really recommend looking at this one. And this is a tool that also does something very similar, which truly tries to block things like ad delivery networks, that truly tries to block things like social share buttons, things that might have problems by their inherent design. We need to advocate really strongly for these kinds of things because if we don't, then we're going to have a web that is slow and clunky and heavy. Though we can consume APIs, sometimes we should say we shouldn't. I say that as someone who works for a company that loves to consume APIs. So it's a challenge to understand when to advocate for what, but sometimes less is more. And if, again, businesses, extraterritoriality is a real thing. Do a PIA. Refactor your practices if you're doing anything bad. If a PIA is too expensive or too complicated, do just a DPIA. Ask the questions just about data privacy, not necessarily the entire business's values. Get SSL. Consider encryption if you can do it. Always ask for consent whenever data is happening. Always be honest about what you're doing. And get a privacy policy. Don't necessarily worry about what it means for GDPR. ask this question for what it means for your business as a high level. So in closing, GDPR is an opportunity. So let's change the way that data is discussed, handled, and collected. Let's help our clients with compliance. Let's build ethics in what we do, and let's build trust in the web again. Thank you, guys. Any questions?